So while people trickle in, I will just start off the introduction. Thank you everyone who's joined us so far and to whoever will join us shortly. Welcome to our Art South Asia project Art Murmur, Curator in Focus, which we're very lucky to have Veeranganakumari Solanki with us. My name is Mala Yamey and I'm the program manager for ASAP. So before we get into the talk, I wanted to start by giving everyone a little bit of an introduction about Art South Asia project, ASAP. We are a UK-based arts education and development non-for-profit. We support initiatives to widen and deepen the engagement with modern and contemporary visual arts from South Asia and its diaspora. We work with institutions and individuals supporting selected research projects, publications, exhibitions, and events. And we offer annual grants and facilitate access to wider knowledge networks in collaboration with expertise across the nations of Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, and the South Asian diaspora. So I'll give you all a little bit of an introduction to our wonderful speaker, Veerangana. Veeranganakumari Solanki is an independent curator and writer based in India. She is interested in the way interdisciplinary forms and creative practices merge to create dialogues in public and private spaces, and the convergence of images across disciplines. Further, her research and practice consider how historical and contemporary thought inform exhibition making and artistic practices. Veerangana was the 2019 Brooks International Research Fellow at Tate Modern and a resident at Delfina Foundation in London. Currently, she is the program director at Space Studio in Baroda, a core team member of Art Chain India, and she teaches the curatorial practice MFA course at Kathmandu University. She is currently curating next month, Future Landing the Arcade at Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa. So I wanted to start before I get into the nitty-gritty of the chat with V about the housekeeping. So please note that this session will take place for about an hour. We're leaving time for questions after. Please stay on mute for the whole session. And if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and I will read them out for Veerangana to speak to. And finally, this session is being recorded and it will be put on our website and our YouTube channel in the next few months. So thank you everyone again and welcome Veerangana.
Thank you, Mala, and thank you, ASAP, Noor, Mala, for hosting me for this evening. And I'm looking forward to a conversation which we've gone over briefly, and I'm excited to share things and also open things up.
I'm very excited. I guess a really good point to start, and I mean, with a lot of people in the audience and myself sometimes are aspiring curators, so to understand, like, where did you start and how did you become a curator?
So I started curating in 2006, 2007. Let's say curating came in much later because I couldn't be a horse trainer. Very far from that initially. But after studying literature, I was studying Indian aesthetics and worked with two researchers, Dr. Firoza Godrej and Dr. Sari Doshi, where it was more with research on mainly the moderns in India, but I was also studying history alongside when I started my master's. And then I think about 2 years after working with them, they encouraged me to join the curatorial team at Bodhi Art. And at Bodhi, it was a very clear divide between the sales team, the curatorial team. So I think that's why it also led to more research, writing, and I moved further away from the number and the marketplace in some sense, which I was very happy to do. But it also involved a lot of conversations with artists, a lot of working with exhibition teams and admin, which I don't think we end up talking about that often either. And then 2009 onwards, in 2009, I did a curator's course at the Guangzhou Biennale. They used to run these short international curator courses. I don't think they are on anymore. And then after coming back from Guangzhou, since 2009, I've been working independently.
And you did have, briefly to segue, but you did have a little bit of commercial experience and you decided that wasn't
very briefly. It was also, I mean, really very briefly, it was more where I think just having to deal with numbers and sales, I don't think I could manage that because I kept going into how artists were thinking, the ideas, where they were coming from. And I don't think that ever translated uh, into making it viable for sales in that sense, because I kept going back to how ideas were forming and developing. So yeah.
And that really came out of also your background in English literature and history and the reading. And how did that background kind of inform? Sorry, I'm going back and forth in your.
You're right, because I think what happened with after studying literature, it was a bit of a reality check. I remember when I wrote my first research paper, I suddenly had all these red marks on that paper, and I was thinking that I don't think I write that badly. I mean, I've just graduated with literature. I'm not sure. And we did have to write a lot. We did research, but something which Dr. Doshi and Mr. Kodir did point out to me at that time was also how I need to start simplifying how I was translating ideas and not making them more complex to read and understand. So it was a lot of unlearning as well on how we were thinking about writing ideas and where it meant bringing in a research and theoretical aspect separately from when it came to exhibition writing that also needed to think of an audience and the translation between what an artist is trying to say and an audience might absorb. So it did help, but it also was a lot of rethinking of how writing could work.
And we've spoken about this before, but I found you've had sort of a very interesting way of the writing between the audience and the link between the artist and the audience. How does the curator also function in that way, in the way you work?
I think again, curatorially, what we end up in some way creating, we don't end up talking about this that often, is the visual narrative that we work with in spaces. And to think of an audience who, rather than assume that the audience is somebody who may already be aware of an artist practice or may already come in with a certain reading or knowledge of what you may be talking about, how that might translate into viewing and experiencing an exhibition, but also offer multiple perspectives, say for if somebody comes in to want to know more, whether you do have text and literature that offers that, but whether just walking in and out of an exhibition can also be an experience. And to be able to build that narrative, I think it's also the challenge that comes in without having to overpower the narrative of what the artist wants to say, or without making something about a curatorial voice itself.
And keeping the artist's voice coming through quite purely.
The artist's voice, but also something which I think, it's a challenge, and I don't know whether it's always successful in terms of whether that translates into a visual, is also just the narrative of space, in that sense of how one may navigate spaces and how we may think about how we are moving between the theory and the visual and how they both exist parallelly. But also going back to the fact that in exhibitions, you can't control your audiences. So how do you also make them accessible? And something which I do think about quite a bit is the idea of memory and time, and whether you can walk away from a space and still remember it, or you still carry away a form of memory through the way you've interacted with the space. And that also ends up being the way you navigate visuals in that way. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And it's a nice kind of way of thinking about the work, kind of maybe showing the work that you've done previously, but also talking about, from your bio, I've mentioned a few of the exhibitions, but you've been part of countless curatorial and exhibition teams for many international exhibitions in India and internationally. So for example, the Kathmandu Biennale in Taipei, and you were curator of residence at Kathmandu. When you're building these interactions with audiences, what are the importance of the relationships you build with them, and how do you create these engagements visually with the artists you work with?
I'll share my screen. I've got a few slides, so just so that is this the right one now?
Yeah, perfect.
It's not my entire desktop now. No.
Yeah, just the slides.
So just move this down here. So I think I'll begin by just showing a few exhibitions that I worked on, and more so to address what we just spoke about with audience interaction. This was an exhibition in Miami with Samakshi Singh, and what ended up happening was that her works got lost. The shipment got lost arriving from China. So Samakshi ended up making new work. We had planned for her to make one site specific work because she does create these immersive installations. And what you see with the audience here, and you see the projection here, it's also where you start seeing how people lose themselves in a space. It's not always possible to have works that are this immersive, but it's also this idea of what audiences may carry away as engagement over time. More with when we speak about local audiences and how we might engage with, just thinking about how do you reach out to those who, especially in short periods of time, like this residency, which was also in 2012 at Casa Masaccio. We were a small group of artists. I was a curator in residence for that, and we really didn't have any interaction with people from the town, but there was the open studio coming up at the museum, and we're just thinking through how we might be able to pull the town in. And there was this one town square where everybody gathered on, I think it was a Saturday. So I've just put 2 slides here. This was Vibha, who created this work inspired by Michelangelo Pistoletto for Mirror Sea, but only we didn't use mirror, we used foil to reflect the sky. And Sonia was taking these rubbings of various drain holes over around the city. And I think just this curiosity and this participation where everyone from the town had interacted with the work, or there was again this way of engagement and of them in some way having been a part of what had been created. All of them came to the opening, and I think what the museum did tell us was that it was the first time that so many people from the town had come into the opening. So that's again something which I don't know whether it's possible through every exhibition, but again, thinking through how we might end up building these local associations as we move from place to place. But I'm not to this slide before that.
And
but,
you did say, I'll just say about the residency, you were mentioning that the residency wasn't really something that invited that interaction. It was something that you as curators and artists built.
We did, because I think about 2 weeks into the residency, we just felt there were 5 of us who'd go to our studio, do what we had to do, and then go back to our apartment. And it was just this back and forth. We didn't know anybody other than the people who were facilitating this for us. But that slowly opened up with these interactions over the weekends and just moving around. And it was also a language barrier because nobody spoke English in this town, and all I think other than 1 or 2 of us, we weren't that fluent with Italian. So, it wasn't so easy to carry on a conversation either. So it was also how visual forms became this way of just connecting in some sense. And, coming back to it, and it was, by the end of it, even if we couldn't speak, there's still people who just gather around, or there's still wave out at the end of it, which was, I don't know. I mean, again, we don't know when we'd go back or when we'd meet them again, but just for that moment that we were there briefly, there was this form of connection that took place. And I think that sense of memory that again came in with this. But another thing that I feel exhibitions and spaces do is build connections over time. So with the Kathmandu Biennale, which you mentioned, for this, it's usually the artist who invites the curators. So Valai had been invited to participate in this. He'd invited me to write a piece and come to install his work. And next door to Valai was an Australian artist whose work was being curated by Jasmine Stephens. And it's funny that you brought this up because Jasmine, about a couple of months ago, reached out, and this was after 2014. We'd barely been in touch, but she's, I think it's just ended the exhibition in Australia, where she invited me to write a piece for the exhibition. So it was again how these crossovers end up building over time. And I think we speak about that as well, of how important it is to build these relations and really maintain them rather than just constantly look at them as temporary forms.
Yeah, definitely.
And
sorry, wanted to
I want to look through just a couple more slides very quickly. This is related to Kathmandu, which I'll also bring in, but this was for the Kathmandu Triennale in 2017, which was curated by Philippe Van Corteren. And it was called The City, where the artists had come to the city. All of them created works in the city itself. So some of them, of course, brought works with them in their suitcases, but everything else was in there. And I was curating the symposium that year. But something that I think we again went back to was trying to include at least one artist or one person from Nepal on each of the panels, just to be able to again draw in the local audience. And what we then realized, and I think that's something which through time will again hopefully change, is the translation aspect of it. Because again, language, but then how accessible it was to students. But just the fact that there was somebody local on each panel also brought in an audience who may otherwise not have been there at that time. So I think that really helped. And one more reference to Kathmandu is Photo Kathmandu, and we'll talk about how these have built up. This was when I was the curator in residence in 2018. Other than just site visits, we were also visiting people who had local archives of photographs, going back to these, and how so many of these archives have now fed into the artists' works, where even 4 or 5 years later, they're still going back to these images. So, yeah.
Is there one more photo? Was there one more photo? I think there was one.
No, I think there were these three.
Perfect. I guess that's a really nice way of going into the idea of building these relationships with so you've talked about the relationships with the communities and the local audiences, but the relationships that you've built with artists and with curators like Jasmine Stevens, as you mentioned, the importance of building these relationships in your career and how these have gone, or the learnings or unlearnings you've had to make.
I think what ends up happening is how it builds what we spoke about, these long-term associations that come in, but the next slide. So for instance, with this is an image of the SKW Lab Fellowship, which I was a part of in 2019. Oh, sorry, this is in 2020.
Don't worry.
Not 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic. But something that has, and going back again to my earlier references of Kathmandu, over time, it's also how much this also involves knowledge sharing and support in some way. So with Nayantara, who's the founder of Photo Kathmandu, Sharari, who's worked with Photo Kathmandu and with the Kathmandu Triennale. There's Sujan, who's the Dean of the Arts and Design Department at Kathmandu University. I mean, we were all together in a curatorial workshop in 2015. But I think it's again where it wasn't about saying, okay, what's the outcome now? It was also about building relationships over time, exchanging ideas, failing at projects that we may have tried, started, and knowing that if something doesn't work, it's not the end, but trying to see what else can work. And I think that's something I've also learned so much from them through this parallel support, which it's about also giving and sharing in that way. With institutional support, Space Studio, where I now program, is Krupa, who's the founder. Krupa and I worked at Bodhi Art many years ago in 2008. So in a way, that connection came back 10 years later. SKW Lab, Vishwa is one of the founders. of SPW Lab, and I've worked with Vishwa for her exhibition on various things. But when we opened Space Studio in 2019, we also commissioned her to do this piece in the distillery, which is one of the exhibition spaces there. So I think what also ends up happening is how over time we start building these crossovers and these links and bridges, and it becomes almost this mesh or network in some way, where I think it's important to be able to maintain that. And a lot of that comes from being willing to share openly.
And that knowledge
learn.
sharing and relationship sharing is also quite rare. So it's really amazing that you really partake in that.
It is, but it also is something which I feel, I mean, there's no, if somebody doesn't do it, it's not like we've all, I think, grown from that. There's somebody who will say, oh, I'll help you out with this. And if you don't get it from here, get it from somebody else. And I think I've experienced that in various situations as well. And the people whom you then start sharing more with, it's also where you can't hold that back because it's not your knowledge to hold. It's out there. It belongs to somebody else. It's not like it's your personal thing. And if you don't do it, somebody else will. So it's also, I think, ways of letting go and trust that come into working through these spaces.
And trust, we've discussed this before, but trust is very, very important. And it also comes into your relationships you have with the artists. And you spoke about artists and galleries and how you navigate these partnerships in long-term, short-term ways.
Again, I think recently a few of us are talking about the importance of contracts and how it's so easy that contracts get breached. And again, this idea of trust that comes in, some people don't want to make contracts, or this guilt that's put on it. But again, I feel that if there is this breach of trust, it may happen once or twice, but then there's also in some way you end up cutting it in that way, and you don't end up working with them again. And then I don't know whether that's a way of moving forward with how we work, because collaborations are how we operate when we are thinking of exhibitions, when you're thinking of exhibition making, thinking of creating. It does grow from conversations. It does grow from the studio into building things with other people. It's not like you're isolated in these moments of just, you create, you write, you produce, and you're out of it. You're doing it with people all through. So I think being open and vulnerable to failures and sharing, and I mean, obviously it happens first with people whom you trust, and then you start building those networks of trust over time.
And so this is obviously the relationships we've talked about here are a little bit international, but it's nice to talk about your, is it the most recent residency, the 2019 residency, would we say? Or
Yes.
one of the most recent at the Delfina with Tate, the Brooks International Research Fellowship. What was your experience of the residency? And it'd be really interesting to go through what the outcomes of your research were. Yeah, so fire away.
So we have to move to the next slide for this. So I think with when I started out at the first month, it was more just understanding how an institute like the Tate worked, because you were there trying to see, sitting in on team meetings, seeing what it meant to think through exhibition making, through collection building, learning what just the operations of an institute on that scale were. But then in the evenings, it'd be coming back to Delfina, and then it was more like this homely atmosphere with students working there, with artists working there. It was like studio visits. And I think just understanding that over time led to meeting a lot of people. And that's how I also met Noor. And then it was, again, through meeting people that Noor connected me with so many. There was Salma and Aaron at Delfina who started connecting with so many artists. And what seemed like the first month that was very slow led to around 35 to 40 studio visits. Wow. Which I kept thinking that I don't know what I'm going to do, because there was all of this content that I was collecting, and they all started off as, I want to do a studio visit, and they were just conversations. And it was also how I think it started off with me wanting to understand where the image was, where how the image was being used with artists. But then while I was there, I realized how prominent this conversation around diaspora and identity were. And I almost slipped into that thinking that, oh no, this is how I'm supposed to think, till it was at some point I had to stop and check myself and say, this is how people may want me to think, but that's not exactly how it is. But since that was something that sort of seeped into the conversation, it was then, okay, let's sort of flip it on and see what else it can be from the artist perspective, because this is more from the institutional, the outside perspective of this is how we look at them.
At the
And
diaspora, you mean
the diaspora.
Yeah.
And that, I think, I don't know how many hours of recordings, and it ended up with so many friendships that I still carry forward even today, and so much sharing, and hours and hours of just like sitting and listening to what it meant to for them, for the artists to be looked at as diaspora on the outside, but when you're thinking about content and form and what it means for them to be working with the image, what it meant for them to be working with various mediums, or what the output was from that point of view. And just in connection with that, it took me a couple of years of just sitting with that, thinking through it, carrying forward these conversations even after coming back to India. The pandemic helped because we had all the time to, get onto Zoom meetings before there were these 40-minute gaps on one-on-one things, and just talk about these a lot more. And then Pix, Rahab asked me to do a series of posts for Pix, and that's when I proposed these 6 images, these 6 posts just still up on their website, which was not about, again, talking about, it was a lead up to the diaspora issue, for which I interviewed Sophia Karim. I haven't put that picture in here, which ASAP supported as well. Yeah.
Good shout out.
It was. So this was a lead up to that. But again, for the diaspora issue, a conversation we did have with Rab was, it wasn't about speaking about what the artists felt necessarily as diaspora, but weaving that into what language they were using to create, and how it might also, in some instances, mean rejecting just being looked at purely as diaspora, feeding into a language that was expected of them because they belong to a diaspora. So I think those parallel conversations of just seeing how the conversations were happening in institutions, in spaces outside of the studios, parallel to how artists were thinking about things, were really quite, how would I put it? It's also where you realize this dichotomy which we are constantly, which we are balancing and having to work with. But there were some artists who'd say things about, you wake up in the morning having to then just one day be Indian or Pakistani because it fills a form and it gives you that grant that you need. But really you go back to your studio without saying, okay, today I have to be this, and you create that. And, just realizing that this is also so much that we impose on people, and stepping back and learning, I think, which is just constant in there. But yeah, I mean, I think outside of that, what was also really special about the residency was just the number of people who I met, the institutes that I got to visit. In AL, the photography festival, where again, it was just meeting people and building these relations, which I don't think you go with the intention of saying, okay, this is what it will be the outcome, but it develops into an outcome over time.
And you've said also that, I mean, we kind of touched on it, that these meetings, as you say, you had, what, 38, was it?
38 to 40
38 to 40
visits.
studio visits, and that those outcomes didn't all have to be something that happened immediately, that you didn't have to press into a machine and it'll come out with a result. So it's these things that you're still working on the outcomes, that these conversations are still ongoing, and
even now,
and the future, they can still keep going as well. I would highly recommend anyone in our audience to go on Pix and read these posts. I've spent some time reading them and listening as well, because they're very, very fascinating. I will move on to your more pedagogical role rather than your role as a curator. It all feeds in. But as the teaching the MFA in curatorial practice at Kathmandu, how do you translate your independent curatorial work for your students, and what's important to prioritize when you are teaching?
So I think over here, this is something that we did talk about when we started the course, and I spoke with Sujan about this, and I've spoken with some students as well in other institutes about how we often end up focusing more on theory and more on the written form with curating. And I think it's also something that we end up having to use more, again, in the research aspect of it. So it's not like I'm dismissing that at all. It's something that we continue, because also being a fairly small group, each of them is working, and the structure of the MFA is between, it's between an MFA and a PhD, the structure, because each of them works on their own projects, which we then start looking at research separately with. But what we are also working on is with them developing their own curatorial language over time, because we did go through the history of curating, the visuals. And what I don't think many art schools pay attention to is how to think through the practicalities of curating, but we sort of learn that along the way. And I don't think there's a way for that to be taught, but learned with time. And we do discuss in great detail, just thinking through displays, exhibition formats, workshops, and like, say, for example, a group of works and a space plan, but about how the layouts might work. Right? Because that's not something that we work with every day, but like whether two videos can be in the same space, whether two works work that way, why the narrative works with these two works being, and that's only something that we grow to learn by visiting exhibitions, by curating over time and making these mistakes. And so I think just this balance of the theory and the visual is what we are focusing on, with the hope that, and we've just finished our first semester. So the first draft of how these curators might be developing what might be called a malleable blueprint of what they want to develop as their core curatorial concerns and language. Because while I may put forth certain exhibitions, certain images, certain forms of theory, it's also different ways of how other people have worked on exhibition making. But how do they take that forward is something that we are working on as well. So the narratives in a space, looking at site, looking at histories of spaces, all of these. Yeah.
And I know we spoke on this when we were preparing for this call as well, but I thought was very interesting was you talked through how theory of curating is actually anecdotal. And it'd be interesting to talk about a little bit more of that. The theory focuses text, but actually it's a focus on visual in a weird way without images.
I think this again comes in where, as curators and researchers, we end up reading to try and feed into our research, and we go into so many texts which we start talking about. But at the end of it, when you talk about curating a space or curating an exhibition, the way we are taking things away is really in a visual format. And I think this goes back to what we spoke earlier about the audience and the importance of how visual curating is as a form. And I think it's again something that has now become quite loose in how everything seems to be curated. But when you think about it, it's also at the end of it, the visual aspect of it. So when you talk about exhibition making, it's how you walk into a space. How do you remember it? How do you navigate it? What do you take away from it? And that in a way becomes, I think, a curatorial intervention with the artist's work, so with the space, and really being sensitive to picking up on these nuances over time, and knowing that it's also about, I think there's a lot of listening that comes in along with the outcome to know what's working, what's not working. And I don't know if I can call it instinct, but we sort of start listening to that in some way, why something will work. And then again, the research feeds in there, because if you're looking at a certain way of, I don't think I'll put that image in, but like say for the Dhaka Art Summit, I'd worked through 4 pockets of time. So while the visuals didn't specifically say that, but with the research aspect of it, each of the 4 sections of the exhibition dealt with 4 different layers of time. So that again comes in where not everybody on the audience might relate to that or look at the exhibition that way, but for those who might be interested in looking at it with more reading, with the
Have the
time, with the
opportunity.
pause,
Yeah.
would hopefully see that too.
And that kind of goes into when you were saying, I mean, I love having conversations again, it's just nice building on each thing. But when you were talking about when you were teaching, you're also constantly learning.
All the time. I don't think we ever stop being students in that way. I mean, it's something which I think the moment you stop learning or stop being a student, you also sort of start moving back, because then you're not open to building new things then.
Yeah.
And that comes with accepting struggles, accepting failures. And I think it's only when, and a lot of conversations that I have with artists, especially young artists in residencies and at Space Studio as well, is how important it is to experiment and allow yourself to, I don't know whether you even call it fail, but allow yourself to make mistakes to know what you don't want to do. And I think we all have to do that in some sense. And it's easier said than done, because you always want to be secure and safe and not have to make that mistake and not have to fail and make sure everything is perfect and amazing. But I don't think that happens.
I think that's real life. Otherwise, we would be robots. What would be a lovely question before we go on to what you're working on right now is, as well as like the teaching aspect, what is your advice you'd give to a student who's studying a curatorial master's, or doesn't have to be a curatorial master's, or anyone who's starting out wanting to get into the curatorial field without a master's, because we know masters can be very expensive. And so just to talk through like what is the advice, and how do you support yourself as well, and as an independent curator, just all these kind of burning questions that people often have.
I think, again, I didn't do a master's in curating as a master's in history at that time. And now JNU in India does have, does offer curating as a course, but it didn't back then. So I pretty much learned just by looking and visiting and going to as many exhibitions as I could. In fact, somebody whom I worked with in the curatorial team at Bodhi, who now works at the Goethe Institute, we were a documenter and we found ourselves taking pictures, not of the artwork. At one point, we were both taking pictures of the pedestal. And we realized that this was maybe 14 years later, even though we are both now in different roles, working on different things. It's also how this idea of looking and still thinking through how you can learn just by visiting exhibitions, by seeing things. Because again, like I said, at curatorial, the output is visual. The way people will absorb what you do is visual. So I think just being open to learn in that sense, and really, like I said, never think you stop being a student. And now it's much easier. I mean, I sound like an old person saying that it's much easier to create like on your computer, create archives of images, which are just ideas. I remember there were times when we'd go and just think of how projectors were installed or how pedestals worked, and then come back and try and see whether that could be replicated in like these minimal budgets that we had. And what you end up calling jugaad over here. And that's something which I've discussed with so many exhibition teams, even in Kathmandu, where, you have like the bare minimum budget. So it's not like you can work with these budgets of saying, okay, amazing, fancy exhibitions, but just working through all of that, which I think only comes by absorbing ideas and researching and looking and reading and learning all the time. Yeah.
And I think it's super important, as you've said, is to like allow that vulnerability and push through that struggle, because eventually the words and the ideas will come.
Yeah.
and the patience to get to the point where it all starts coming
And
together.
I think it's also not having this fear, not being scared about experimenting. Because I think when we go back to like some of the early shows that I curated, I also cringe because I just think that's not what I do today. That I don't think I would, and I don't even say that what I'm doing today is amazing, but it's also where I've arrived at today has been because I've done all of that and hopefully be able to get better from here as well.
So yeah,
But yeah.
keep learning from each thing you do and keep reading,
Yeah.
learning. Amazing. So what I'll move to the last kind of question before we open up, but to look at kind of the really exciting work you're doing on Serendipity Arts Festival. So it would be fascinating to learn about the research process, maybe give a little insight into the artists that will be in the show, and yeah.
So I just have a screenshot for that, and I think with Future Landing, when we conceptualized Future Landing, it was in 2020, just when the pandemic had hit. We were first thinking of what we might end up working on as a physical form for Serendipity, but then sorry.
Have some water.
What ended up happening was that when we started thinking of the virtual format, everything that I was seeing was, these gallery spaces where images were being pasted, or just different ways in which all of us were trying to create this visual output to connect with everyone. And then there was this incredible team of 3 coders and the Serendipity Arts team where we said, okay, let's build a website from scratch. And I thought, okay, one thing that we end up doing when we think about curating is we try and control the narrative. We try and control what the visual output is. But we also at a time when we couldn't, we didn't know what these lockdown deadlines were. We thought, okay, this is the date they've given us. We are out and free. So a lot of future learning also came from this idea of letting go of control. With the crazy, I'll say with the amazing team who took on my crazy ideas of building and coding this website from scratch. It also meant that this website, and it still exists, changes almost every time you go back to it. Sometimes you see the changes, sometimes you don't. So we invited 5 artists to think about, they could use their backend the way they wanted. I didn't have access to the backend, so they uploaded their own works. We obviously discussed what they were thinking about and how they would move through transiting the work over time. But their brief was that nothing about the work should be constant. And every time somebody came back, it was an individual experience. There were times, so for instance, with Farah Mullah, there were 5 artists to begin with: Farah Mullah, Abhinay Koparzi, Nepal Picture Library, the Packet and Studio Oleominis. But see, with Farah's work, for instance, which was a sound activated work, I got a recording back from a friend of her daughter singing to a screen. There were others, like with Nepal Picture Library, the way it's translating now to its physical format. Over there was like this board where I remember somebody wrote back saying that they were going to think about this for their website because you couldn't keep that board. You came back to the images being shuffled again. So it's, again, nobody had the same experience going back to any of these artists' works. And one of the things which they'd gotten the brief was that after a year, they choose whom they want to pass it on to as a virtual studio. So 5 of them nominated 5 other artists. A few of them fought with me, not in a bad way, just about the fact that they had to choose who to pass it on to, which also comes down to thinking, curatorially, you may not be able to include every artist or everyone in the same exhibition, but here it was artists having to make those choices. And well, we now have 5 other artists who are a part of Future Landing, and they can choose when they want to pass on their pages. So in a way, it has this amoebic growth in some way that just expands and loses a sense of structure as well, because it goes on to the artists having control over their backends, then using this web space as change. And the landing page, what I have on the screen right now, is is a series of screenshots taken periodically from the artist's pages. So as they change, the landing page images also change with time. But I think there's such a large database of these images that you don't see it immediately. You only see it when you come back over time of how different they are because they're just moving at the speed. And for when we started thinking of the physical format, it was a bit challenging because I think the online was also about moving away from the physical. So then to take what we moved away from into thinking about the arcade as a physical form, what we've again moved back to the artist and have full control over each of their spaces. It's called the arcade because they work with individual. I'm not going to give away too much, but they work with individual spaces. But I think something that will be consistent is that none of the works can be experienced without being activated by an audience. And that is how they're also thinking of it in the space this December.
That's very exciting. And will this future landing online, if that passing on, how long do you think that'll keep going, or is that just like a
well, hopefully I'm hoping it goes on for eternity because these 5 artists pass it on to another 5 and then they pass it on another 5. So in some way, I know we've spoken about the funding aspect, and sorry, this is also going back to your earlier question about supporting yourself. I think with this, it might involve artists having to raise funds independently because that's something we couldn't budget for as a constant way of giving. But I'm hoping that it becomes this form of artists using, this web space that is hosted by Serendipity, but can become quite fluid for them to experiment with. And I think especially now with so many artists working with technology, needing these web platforms and having the sense of, but a temporary audience because it needs to keep changing in some way, that this will keep growing.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I can't wait to go and have a look, and everyone else who's listening should
also. It looks very different from that now, though.
Okay, I'll go have a look at it today. And also, as a reminder, please do all read Veerangana's interviews and listen to them on Pix. And if you're in Goa in December, please go see the physical show. I'm going to open up the questions to the audience now. So please put your questions in the chat if you have them, and we will speak to them.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Mala. It's not that often that I think we end up getting to talk about the practicalities and the visual forms of curating. It's usually quite specific to some form of research or something quite curricular in that sense.
And it's really nice as well, especially with Art Murmur, all of our sessions is this idea of the behind the scenes and these conversations that we see in exhibition or we read a text, you don't really see what's come into it before. And I think having these conversations opens that up. We don't have any questions yet. Please don't be shy, anyone who would like to put a question in. I have one more question which I can ask if we don't have a question. We do have a question. Let's go for it. So Femina has asked, I wanted to ask, what is the spatial factor involved in your curatorial note?
I can understand spatial factors.
Is this the spatial factors for future landing or but trying to understand. But maybe thinking about how do you consider spatial factors when you think of your curatorial note?
Is it, sorry, Samia, is this specific to future landing or just space as curating in a way? Space which is display. So I think with space related to display, and I haven't pulled in too many images, but I think just going back, let me just open up Vishwa's work. Something which I do end up thinking about quite a bit is the architecture of a space. And what I find in the right window. What I find quite exciting is to work with spaces that are not white cube spaces, that are spaces which require this challenge of working with raw walls, working with. I mean, there was once a space in Delhi where actually the contemporary Sultanate, where we had like dogs and birds who want to come and sleep at night because it was that raw space. But it's also what I find very satisfying is what we get out of that. So it's maybe spatial in
Not
Samakshi work.
the first photo.
Um, but I feel that the space ends up also contributing to the narrative of how we experience works, and then it becomes about not isolating the work from the space itself. In some cases, you have to. It's not like every work can speak to the space, but to see how the space becomes a part of it, because you can't just ignore the place that you're walking through unless it's a IQ space, because then it's completely built up and there's nothing to do with how you experience it. So I don't know if I've answered that question, Selena.
I guess it's also interesting if you're working with artists who you want to work with an artist and they maybe don't fit in the space you want to work with. How do you kind of play with that or juggle that difficulty?
I think very often what ends up happening is that, I mean, say for instance, this exhibition in particular was a response to the space itself because it was the first exhibition at Space Studio. But when it comes to certain other works, I always work with the layout with the artists. So it's not just saying, okay, I want this work, whether it fits or not. But I do work through, like say, working first through what the artist may propose based on the concept note or the preliminary note that I may have shared with them of the curatorial ideas. How they may say that they want to work with X number of works. There have been times when an artist may want like so many works, but it's also where, again, I think that's where you start balancing things in, because those many works are not fit in the space, or it may be a very small work, which is what the artist can give, but then how do you highlight that work in a large space? So I think that's where the narrative of how somebody may walk through the space and experience the artwork comes in, to either not let one artist's work overshadow the exhibition, or an artist who has a smaller work but still give them that space which expands it into something more.
Wonderful. So we have a couple more questions which hopefully you can answer. One from China, who we're very close to the APAC team. The first question is, I'm wondering which project is closest to your heart and practice.
Right now, Chinar, it's really future landing. I can quite openly say that because it's been so much. I've learned so much from future landing, just with what it means to collaborate, what it means to let go of control, what it means to like work with artists' ideas and help like realize those in the capacity they want to realize them in without the constraints of space. Because it's also been an online space, which has been very, very exciting. And I think I'm quite excited about how this is going to unfold in Goa as well, because the artists have just been, and here's where for the first time in these constraints of space come and being like, this is all the space we have, what can we do with it? We've actually gone to the extent of seeing, can we expand like parts of the building to build more space, or to do that, which we couldn't, but it's still about not having to control what the outcome is completely. And I think that letting go of control has also been quite a learning experience and has allowed me to step back and look at future landing from, I think, from a distance too, which I don't think I've had while working on an exhibition in the past.
A question from Pramodha, which asks about how you view or work with text as a curator. I wonder if this is working with text, which is an artwork, or text on the wall.
So I've worked. So maybe I'll answer the artwork part of it first. So I think in 2019, 2020. There have been artists who work with text. So there was a series of Sophia Karim's drawings, The Architecture of Disappearance, which was a part of the exhibition, but she also had poems in that. And we created a nook for where you could sit and read and spend time reading. If that's about text, I think it's also about giving this space and which allows for time to slow down. And I've worked in that format with a couple of exhibitions in the past. In terms of text, if it's about writing as a curator, so what it ends up working in 3 stages. When I do write to the artists or to the space to which an exhibition may be proposed, it's with a preliminary concept that's quite, I try not to in any way put in very specific ways of what the outcome should be or how I'm thinking of an idea developing only from one point of view, even if I have that in mind. Because I think what's important is that for the artists who I speak with or invite to the exhibition are able to expand that idea in directions which I may not even be thinking about. So that's the first layer of the text. The second layer is when I'm thinking through my own writing, which maybe while the artists are creating, I'm doing my part of the text as well, which then sort of weaves its way into what the artists are then thinking about, my conversations with them, which come into the final curatorial text, is usually how I break it up. And it's quite messy when I think about how I edit, but thankfully I don't have to show that to anyone, so it's fine.
Maybe we have time for one final question. I'm gonna move past because I'm gonna ask Himani, is going back to the spatial. How do you interact? Maybe it's about the site specificity of your work, but how do you interact with the history of the building or the space that you work with, and how the modern white cube has kind of lost the history of the architecture? I think I'm asking the question correctly. So maybe this is about working with site specific for your cube.
So, sorry, Pramod asked about artwork and that's I'm getting distracted. So with this space, which is on my screen right now, how the modern white cube space is erased of history. Like I said, I personally, even though white cube spaces are the easiest to work with, they're also perhaps my least favorite to work with. Because I think what ends up happening in white cube space is that this challenge of what you see as an output is it's not that challenging anymore then. But I think when it comes to the history of these spaces, let me see if I can pull out the contemporary something very quickly to show you some images there. And the reason I want to try and pull that out is when I'm thinking of spaces that are not white cube, it also becomes important to consider the history of the space in some ways. So this, where the distillery is, most of the artists were thinking through architecture, what it meant to look at the history of just this building. And that's similar to what had happened. Just pull this out. Okay, now I can look for it.
You got it?
But yeah, no, I can't find it. It's in some presentation. I should have pulled out a couple of these, but I think it's also where I do go, and even for Goa this time we're working in the old excise, the old sales tax building, but I don't think I'm going to be able to build that into the history of the exhibition itself or pull that into the text of the exhibition. But we're still trying to leave the space as raw as possible because it's not about changing it and completing.
It's respecting the space.
Yeah.
You're working.
Let's see if I can find that.
We can also share it with the people who joined after. If you want to send it to me, I can send the links out to the people who joined.
I don't think it's online.
Don't worry then. We can
just one thing.
There we go.
So this is what the space looked like for the contemporary Sultanate. There was an army of ants living under a partition. This was a space where we had like birds coming in. This was a work by Charmi Gadasha. She made a tiny work under the staircase. So the artist really worked with the architecture of the space over here. Over here, Nandan Ghia, Bose, Krishnamachari, and Rax Media all worked with different versions of what were looked at as skylines, Tower of Babel. And these were the references that they were thinking about. And this is how raw the space was. So, I mean, we could have had other things in here, but we were really thinking of the architecture of the space when there was this exhibition. And each one's work over here, Arun Kumar made something with bottle caps that fit in to the frame of the window as well. So I think in those instances, the space becomes quite important. And then this is an exhibition which I did with Sunil Gupta for the 2013 Focus Photography Festival. And the reason that we chose to work with these pictures from LA over here were to offset against the David Sisson Library at the back. So again, working with architecture in some way. So again, where there was no way we could directly connect it with that, but to see how the visuals might work. Yeah.
Thank you.
That makes sense. Yeah.
You've been so
thank
generous
you
with all of your insights and images and experiences. And whoever did not manage to make the talk will be able to view this talk on YouTube, and I'm sure it'll be a very valuable resource for students, current curators, even senior curators. So thank you again, and thank you everyone who came to listen. And I will now end the meeting. But
thank you so much, Mala. Thank you, Noor, and thank you for this conversation.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.